Today we're going to look at benchmarking DCS. I have the Steam World Edition playing in the background, and I have to start off by saying I am a beginner pilot at best. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm sorry. I have to subject you to terrible flying. That's all I know how to do. Today's benchmarking, we're going to look at CPUs, some NVIDIA graphics cards, as well as screen performance, which I did at 1080p. That's looping in the background. And I also did some VR performance. So again, I want to restate that I don't know how to fly a jet, a plane, anything, let alone how to arm missiles in an F-18 and fire them at a target. I don't have a clue. I downloaded the manual. It's crazy. And I totally have mad respect for you guys that can do this. But first, I want to talk about some of the technical details about what this benchmarking entails. I have the Syria map. I started with the Bekaa Valley mission, and that's all I'm flying. That's what it just looped back there to start again. That is the benchmark. It's 6 minutes long. It's just me cruising around, doing a few things, nothing too advanced. I know multiplayer servers have a much higher demand. I welcome the opportunity to use those track files for future benchmarks. I'll talk about that again at the end of the video if you are a DCS veteran, you want to help me out in future benchmarking. Normally my rig is set up for sim racing. That's what I've done all my previous benchmarking with, but I can switch it over into Thrustmaster flight mode, which I can show here, and it's decent, although I should really get a quick release for that wheel. Anyways, here's the lineup of CPUs we're going to be looking at today. I've only been able to find the X3Ds on eBay, which is terrible, but all the other prices are holding pretty steady to what when I last looked at this a couple months ago. I have not yet invested into Intel's latest platform because they haven't really given me a compelling reason to do so. Someone recently asked me, hey, why don't you have a 14900K for your testing? And my reply is, it's not a good deal. It's overpriced, even though it's significantly less than when it came out. If I were looking to get an 8-core processor, I would consider the Ryzen 7700X or 9700X because AM5 is an active socket and not a dead one like LGA 1700. Before the benchmarks, I'm going to run my intro, which includes those that support this channel and my efforts. If you like this benchmarking, if you want to see more, please go to my Patreon or give me a super like, something like that. These components are only getting more expensive and I need your help to keep doing it. Thanks. First up, let's take a look at the graphics settings that I used. I went through YouTube and a couple forum posts, and this is what I settled on. Obviously, the resolution changes for my testing scenario, but everything else was the same. If I had made any catastrophic errors here, please type it out in the comments below. DCS normally has a max FPS of 300, but I have overridden that within the config file to make it 900. Normally, we want an unconstrained FPS, so no G-Sync, no V-Sync. We want the FPS to go as high as possible when benchmarking. Okay, so here is the Syria Bekaa Valley capture that I have. This is a track file that I'm showing here at 1080p. Notice how it includes the head movement because I actually did this in VR, my flying. I don't have a track IR setup. I would assume that would also record your head movement, just like it records the cursor movements and what you select in the cockpit. I'm using a track file for the flight because run-to-run consistency is critical for benchmarking. If I was to do this live with real-time gameplay capture, that would be very difficult because I would have to follow the exact same flight pattern. I'd have to move my head in all the same places and repeat that on each benchmark run for each CPU and graphics card. That would be very difficult and prone to error. I did not measure a meaningful difference in FPS or performance by running real-time versus track replay. So that's what we're going to do here. As per usual, I'm going to send the gameplay footage up to the top, and we'll have the bar graphs and other charts underneath. Oh, and I'm also going to edit out all of the alarms that I find annoying from the aircraft because I don't want that interrupting you during this video. Just to walk you through the elements of the first bar chart, we have the average FPS in the turquoise color, and then the pink bars represent the average of 1% lows, and then within that, I have the 0.1% lows in the black text. And then within each bar on the far left-hand side, we have GPU busy. This metric helps us understand how much work the graphics card is doing. I used a 4080 Super from NVIDIA with 16 gigabytes for all of the CPU testing. If we look at the top of the chart with the 13700K, it has a GPU busy of 97%, which is to say, during the creation of each frame, the graphics card was, on average, 97% busy doing meaningful work. All of these performance results are interesting and good for a glance, but we need to dive into each one to understand what the heck is going on. I'll do my best to explain what I think is happening, but this is a new simulator to me. I just got it over the holiday break. I need input from you guys. I need to learn from you guys. So type in the comments, send me an email. Let's figure it out together. There's so much to talk about. I'm going to move this off to the side so I can put in some text. First up, are we looking at a graphics card bottleneck at single 1080p resolution? The top 4 processors are only separated by 5%. Usually when a chart flattens out like this, that suggests there's another component besides what's being analyzed that's affecting our performance. Also notice that the GPU busy for these processors is greater than 95%. That's when I normally see a card go into a thermal limit, a GPU utilization limit, a power draw limit, something like that. But we also have some indicators that something else is happening here. If we look at the order that the CPUs are in, the 5800X3D is outperforming a 9800X3D. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And when we look at the average 1% lows and the average 0.1% lows, they're like all over the place. It looks a bit chaotic. All right, and the last takeaway is that the bottom 4 CPUs are all 6-core CPUs, and the top are all 8 cores. So I'm also wondering maybe DCS leverages the cores and the threads available to it. And that would be dissimilar to a lot of the racing simulators that I've tested where single core performance matters the most. So I first wanted to understand, is that GPU busy metric accurate? And I decided to focus in on the AM5 socket for this round of analysis. Looking at other GPU sensors and metrics, I noticed that the time spent at the GPU limit is not what I would expect for 100% GPU busy. This should be maxed out, and it's not. Another clear indicator of how much work the graphics card's doing is how much power is it drawing. The 4080 Super at stock values can go about 315 watts, and we're using, just over half of that. And these two data points contradict the GPU busy. And what does that exactly mean? I'm not sure. It's unlikely to be an inefficiency in the NVIDIA drivers or a glitch with the card. It's possible that the way that the GPU busy is being calculated is not compatible with how DCS is actually doing the rendering. Or there might be a flaw in my testing methodology. I'm doing something wrong on my end and it's showing up here in the data. What I do know is that the run-to-run consistency from DCS, even though I'm using a track file, there are glitches in it. Now, to the DCS veterans out there who are trying to make highlight videos, you know track files can't be trusted. And so I shouldn't be surprised that there are FPS dips that happen in one run and not in another. And we're seeing that with this frame time chart. But I have also forced it to run beyond its FPS limit of 300. So maybe it's just glitching out because they never designed it to run this fast. Some games just aren't well suited for high FPS benchmarking. Maybe DCS is one of those. While I have the frame time charts up, we might as well look at other CPUs. So here's the 7600X, and we can see a clear variability in its average frames per second across the 6-minute benchmark run. The 3D V-cache from the 9800X3D does a much better job maintaining a certain pace, a more consistent pace of frame rate. The 5800X3D actually slightly outperformed the 9800X3D, but when we look at the frame time chart, it didn't do so with that more consistent frame time, that more consistent FPS. Switching to the 7800X3D, and it seems to be kind of somewhere in the middle. It looks more like a 9800X3D on the AM5 platform, but again, not quite as stable. Last up is the 13700K, and yes, it did have the highest FPS, but those lows, those FPS dips, we can clearly see the frame time pacing to be more inconsistent. So even if the DCS physics or render engine isn't well suited for high FPS benchmarking, I'm still able to see a difference between these processors, between these platforms, and the technologies of the architecture themselves. All right, it's time for some VR benchmarks. I'm using the same settings in graphics configuration as I had shown earlier. And when benchmarking the CPUs, I used my 4080 Super with a Valve Index. The Index is a lower resolution headset these days, which means I can remove the graphics card from being a bottleneck in the rendering situation. So any differences we see between the CPUs, it's because of those processors, not because of the 4080 Super. As you can see, my Angry Bird, which I have the headset situated on, and it keeps the headset activated, it is not moving. It is a stationary bird. Therefore, the perspective on the screen and in the headset, it is static. It's just always looking forward, which I guess doesn't actually represent how you would be using this headset, but it does create a stable and consistent benchmark run. And that's what I need to actually compare these processors and graphics cards. Benchmarking VR has its own unique challenges. In my case, I'm running 90 Hertz on the Valve Index, therefore I want 90 FPS. I also want all of the frame times delivered by the CPU to be on time, and that's what this chart represents. Average FPS is the gray bar per processor, and then the colored bar is the on-time percentage by that processor to deliver frame rates consistently. This data is captured through FPS VR, an application you can buy off of the Steam store. With the graphics settings that I have chosen and using a 4080 Super, apparently, if you look at this, all the processors perform almost identically. That doesn't mean, for example, the Ryzen 9800X3D is delivering the same performance as the Ryzen 5600, but if the requirement is just 90 Hertz with these settings, they can deliver in the headset a very similar experience. And one last reminder that the headset is always facing forward. Should I have that thing moving around, maybe we'd see these slower, older processors struggle with that. Better way to understand VR performance is with a histogram chart or an area chart, and that's what I'm going to show next. Starting with the graphics card, and in this case the 4080 Super, here's the distribution of its ability to deliver frames on time. Across the x-axis are the buckets, which in this case is frame times to 0.1 of a value. And then on the left-hand side with the y-axis, this is counting how much frame time was in that bucket, shown as a percentage. So I can describe this through a few examples, and we'll start with the 90 Hertz timeline, which is a dashed line at 11.1 milliseconds. The graphics card must resolve its work before 11.1 milliseconds, otherwise it's late. That becomes a dropped frame, or you can risk reprojection. How did we get to 11.1 milliseconds? Well, there are 1,000 milliseconds in 1 second. And 90 Hertz, that's also by a per second ratio. So we just take 1,000 divided by 90. That equals 11.1. Therefore, we want every frame to be less than 11.1 to render. So let's add the 3080 Ti and its data set to this chart. It is almost able to deliver all of its frames on time, but we see that 90 hertz line and a set of green data to the right. Those are late. If your headset supports motion smoothing, if you've enabled it to inject fake frames to make up for the fact that it is late, maybe this appears to be a mostly smooth experience. If you're not running that tech, it could appear as a stutter in the headset. When I added my 3060 Ti and 2070 Super, we can see what late frames look like. Clearly, all of these are delayed, and these cards are not running at 90 FPS or 90 hertz. I would have to reduce the resolution and graphics quality dramatically to try and bring these cards on time. I'm going to remove the fill from the charts just so that we can see all of the distribution more clearly when they overlap. And I'm going to add back in the bar charts that show the average FPS in gray and the colored bar showing the on-time performance. For evaluating CPUs, I'm going to stick with the 4080 Super for obvious reasons. It's on-time delivery for performance. It will not hiccup and cause problems in evaluating CPUs. So I'm going to bring back that bar chart, which is a bit misleading, and put it up here in the top corner, and now I'm going to bring in the frame time chart for all of these CPUs. Leading the chart is the 9800X3D with outstanding performance, clearly standing above all other CPUs, and it looks like a generational leap up from the 7800X3D, even though they're both on the AM5 socket. The fastest Intel I have is the 13700K, and it lags behind those two 3D cached chips, but looks very similar to a 5800X3D on the last gen AM4, here shown in orange. If I had the fastest Intel 14th gen chip, yeah, it would beat these guys, but you're not catching the 9800X3D. Meanwhile, let's look at the 6-core processors, starting with the Intel 12600K in purple. And this is a great example on how to read an area chart like this, because when we compare it to the yellow 7600X, the purple is considerably better. It delivered most of its frame times beneath 8 milliseconds, while the yellow 7600 drifts well on past that. Its purple peaks are also much higher, suggesting that it's delivering lower latency more regularly than the 7600X. The Ryzen 5600 delivers on-time performance just beneath that yellow dashed line, while the Ryzen 3600 slips past. So you could look at all this data and think, well, wow, I mean, just any old CPU from the last 6 years is probably good enough for DCS. Hold your horses. That's jumping a little too far of a conclusion for my liking. And this is where I need your help. I heard that multiplayer servers, they're a different beast. There's so many more military assets deployed. There's so much more to render. It's more demanding on the computer systems. I don't have that. I don't know how to fly one of these. I can't even complete the first basic mission objective in that campaign I've been benchmarking. So if any of you have an F-18, you have the Syria map, I need a track file, and I think I could just get one of yours and benchmark it, can't I? So the only requirement is that it needs to be like the first 10 minutes of gameplay, nothing else. If it takes you 20 minutes to get to that computational high demand area, that's too long. I need to be able to get it going as quick as possible and benchmark it. So you can send me an email, leave a comment below. My email is benchmarkodysseys@gmail.com. Just a few more benchmarks now before I sign off on the video. I've benchmarked with 64 gigabytes this whole time. I do have results with 32 gigabytes, and there really wasn't much of a difference. In fact, when I did the 9800X3D with the 3080 Ti, which only has 12 gigabytes of VRAM, I knew it was writing more to a paging file or more to system memory when I had 32 gigs, so I thought performance would get better. With 64 gigs, it actually got kind of worse, but this is just preliminary tests. I can't draw a conclusion from this yet. Hopefully with a better track file with more demand in it, I'll have something that is more substantial for us to look at. Oh, and these tests that I just showed you were at a slightly different graphics quality. That's why the 3080 Ti is struggling here. I've also seen users suggest that decreasing the window size of the view, the VR view on your desktop, that can actually gain performance when you're using VR, and I haven't been able to replicate that. I tried two different configurations. One was with the 7600X and my 4080 Super. And then I also tried my 9800X 3D with a 3060 Ti. And in these scenarios, I just couldn't reproduce a situation in which frame rate changed based upon what window was rendered on the desktop. All right, last thing, and I promise, I have a capture card. And with this, I'm able to capture what goes to the display whenever I'm benchmarking something or recording performance, and it isn't done by the computer that's rendering. So this is the authentic performance without an impact of recording it. I'm going to release this type of content in separate videos from these big kind of comprehensive reviews that I'm doing so that you guys can find this on my channel. I'll make a playlist for it, I guess, so you can easily view it and do that kind of side-by-side comparison. What I would warn is that there can be hiccups from the capture card. I haven't perfected this yet, so I wouldn't scrutinize the image itself as much as I would pay closer attention to the actual, in this case, FPSR data that's coming through. Okay, so that about sums up everything. I hope you guys enjoyed. Please give me your feedback. Please send me your track files, and let's make another run at benchmarking DCS.